Have you ever frozen in the key moment of making a critical decision? Whether it's in business or in life, it can cost you everything. Commander's Intent will teach and inspire you how to lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. So here's your host, retired Air Force Colonel, fighter pilot, and your leadership mentor, Derek Oaks.
Hello again, I'm Derek Oaks, and welcome again to Commander's Intent. I'm here back with my co-host and friend, Rob Powell, and we're going to talk about something that every single one of us deals with on a daily basis, and that is hazards and risk, and what exactly that means. And I'm not here to provide you a how-to manage risk or like a simple checklist or anything like that. Each of us kind of needs to figure that out on our own, but all of us deal with risk daily. Am I going to drive to work today or am I going to walk to work? Am I going to ride a bike? Is it bad weather or not? Am I going to go skiing? And if I go skiing, what kind of protective gear am I going to wear? Or am I going to engage in any other kind of sports to where the hazards associated with that sport are pretty much staring me in the face? I know that I have friends and acquaintances who watch news all the time, and they get really worked up about the hazards that are thrown in our face daily by news anchors about all the catastrophic things that are going to happen to us. We're going to talk a little bit about what that really means when you talk about the hazards and how bad it could be and the negativity about it. What are you really controlling when you're performing risk management? Now, I'm going to turn over to Rob a little bit here so he can talk for a second about his thoughts on risk management. And then we're going to go into what is a risk and what is risk management in general, but what is a breakdown of a risk? And what's a risk for me, a dangerous risk or a bad risk for me that is not one for you or vice versa? So any thoughts on that as we get started here, Rob?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. You know, it's interesting because risk is obviously a big part of any of the thought process decision-making that goes into, military missions and more specifically in aviation and flying. I found that, all the risk mitigation, risk assessment, all the risk factors that we talked about in the military were the same way when I got into the civilian world and flying airplanes just for a commercial business. So the funny thing is I think that the risk assessment and risk mitigation has been somewhat formalized in the aviation business. A lot of other businesses could actually learn from what they've done because you've gone from something that's an inherently risky, flying an airplane, especially in, potentially poor weather, and then obviously in combat ups the risks a little bit different, but you've taken something that's inherently pretty risky and we've made it pretty pedestrian where people jump on airplanes, every single day flying across country and don't really think about the myriad of risks that they pilot and the crews are facing. I go back to, when I was a young lieutenant in the military, the big thing I heard from a lot of my commanders is, safety is paramount. Safety is number one. We have to do safety. But we got a little more mature as we went along. About the 14, 15-year mark, as a commander, I heard myself and others no longer saying that safety was the number one mission and that safety wasn't paramount, because if safety were paramount, we wouldn't turn a prop, we wouldn't start an engine, we wouldn't leave the ground, because flying is an inherently risky business. And so you have to find a way. Ultimately, you cannot get to zero risk in your life, no matter what you do. And so that's why it becomes one of the keystone pieces of decision making is you have to be able to learn how to A, identify risk, B, accept risk, and C, mitigate any risk that you're going to try to accept to allow you to what we ultimately ended up in the military is coming down to we must be able to do safe mission accomplishment, just not safe.
I love that. As I've thought about risk and how to manage it, there are a couple things that have really turned my thinking on risk. Number one is every day we manage negative impacts, because what is risk? Risk is the impact that a certain action can have on me and the negativity involved in that. But there's also the likelihood that it's going to involve. That's a key component of it. And the uncertainty, because that hazard is not a guaranteed event. Like if I go into the south side of Chicago, and you watch a lot of news stations, they'll tell you that South Chicago there's gunfire, there's literally bullets zipping by on every single street. And I'm not saying that it's one of the safest places in the United States right now. But what I am saying is that there are a lot of people who live their lives there and they deal with those hazards, but they're able to mitigate those hazards by not going out at night, by avoiding certain areas. They're able to manage those hazards so that the likelihood of them happening to them is still there. And it still would be, not amazingly, but to a high level, the impact would be negative, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. When I go out and drive in a snowstorm, it's not a guarantee that I'm going to wreck my car. It's not a guarantee that I'm going to slide into a curb. When I go snow skiing, it's not a guarantee, and I just started wearing a helmet the last couple of years when I was skiing, and that's part of my risk management, but it wasn't a guarantee that I was going to go off a run and run into a tree and kill myself. The impact of that made me see, or the potential impact that said, you know what, actually a helmet is warmer than a hat. A helmet, it's easier for me to ski with earbuds so that I can have a phone call and listen to music. So it all played into my decision making. But we focus on the negativity and the hazard, and we don't think about the likelihood of it or the uncertainty of it happening. Completely focus. We almost focus it as if it's a foregone conclusion. That negative impact is going to happen to us. If I go out and drive, then I'm going to get killed. If I go skiing, I'm going to, mess up my knee. If I go on the south side of Chicago, it's going to kill me. I go back to flying aircraft. I flew the A-10 for a lot of time. I flew airlift aircraft for a while, and we would fly low altitude. And then I started flying the A-10, and I upgraded to combat search and rescue pilot, where we learned how to fly at 100 feet. And 100 feet going 300 and 350 miles an hour, the world's going faster pretty quickly. And the first couple of times you do it, it's an eye opener. The first couple of times you do it, you go, those rocks are, and I'm really close, and this makes me nervous. After you've done it for a number of hours, you really don't think about it. And it's not because those rocks are any less dangerous. It's not because the hazards have completely disappeared. It's because my risk mitigation is that my practice has reduced the likelihood of me hurting myself doing that because I became competent in doing it. It's just like, a mountain bike or that snow skier. Me snow skiing, there are a lot of runs I'm not going to go on, because I know I'm not that good. I'm not 20 anymore where I thought I could go on any run, and I'm not there anymore. And so I pick runs that I can manage a little bit better. And I do those things. I go into the Maverick gas stations, which are close to my house, all over the place, and they have a big screen TV over the soda station. And on that big screen TV, you've got kids going down the single track spine of a red dirt mountain where if they fall, it may not be certain death, but it's certain broken bones, no question. I look at that, I think, that's crazy. The negativity and the impact of that, of certain death or broken bones, is not worth it for me. And part of that is because the likelihood of me being successful is not very good. Not a good mountain biker. I can ride a bike, but not in a course like that. I don't have the practice. I don't have the confidence. And then the last thing I'll say about that, before I'll let you get in a word edgewise there, Rob, is that when I put myself in a situation where I'm exposed to hazards, the question I always have to ask myself is, what is the potential goal? What is the reward for exposing myself to that? Like when I flew at 100 feet, it was because I didn't want to be seen by radar, and I didn't want to be tracked by enemy search mechanisms, and being down at 100 feet made it a whole lot more difficult for them to find me, to track me, and to shoot me. So flying at 100 feet made a lot of sense. It made a lot of other things harder, but it made a lot of sense to me. Like Rob said at the very beginning, there are a lot of environments where I flew airplanes where on a normal day with nothing going on, it wouldn't make sense to fly. But because people's lives were at stake or the mission was critical, it was critical for me to fly in order to execute the mission, I went ahead and flew because the goals outweighed the hazards and the likelihood of those hazards.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, totally. All the things you're talking about. You went down to 100 feet. You do that in the daytime, though, right?
Daytime, yeah. And I'm sure you do it at night.
Right. And so when we did it 200 feet, but we did it at night. And why was I able to do it at night where most pilots would say, flying 200 feet at night is really stupid? Well, we had a lot of things in our favor. Number one, we wore the very best night vision goggles that you could get. And so to me, flying at night was just about like flying in the daytime, depending on how much illumination there was. And then we practiced continually in how to operate the aircraft at that altitude and how to carry out the mission while dodging all the other risks and threats and hazards that we could find ourselves down at 200 feet. And so to your point, why did we do it? Well, partially because it was cool, but mostly we did it because that was what the mission demanded and dictated. The type of missions that I was flying in special ops, same thing. We're trying to make sure that the enemy doesn't have a chance to pick us up visually or on radar or anything else. And that's the only way to make the mission happen. To your point about the kids on the mountain bikes on the single track spine, it's pretty funny. I'd only been in special ops for about 3 or 4 years, and I was still, I think, in that kind of mindset that I still saw it as kind of amazing. Like, how did some of these people come up with this stuff? It was pretty neat to watch, all the things come together for a mission to work. But about the same time, they had the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I don't remember what network had the Olympics on, but they did a whole 15, 20-minute segment on all of the people that were doing all the tricks on the ski ramps and the jumps they have all these different people doing these just kind of insane tricks. They're doing flips and leaps and everything, and they're tens of feet in the air with a lot of risk to their bodily harm. And I thought it was pretty funny because they basically said that, oh, well, those extreme athletes really are a lot like special operators in the military. And I thought that was kind of funny because I was a pretty brand new special operator. But the more I thought about it, the more it was absolutely spot on. One of the things I learned in my career as a special operator is the things that we think from watching movies or TV shows or even reading books, we think that special operators kind of just go out there and pull it all out and make things up as they go along. And the reality is there have been many, many, many hours of training, preparation, to get to the point where it becomes that second nature. It becomes easy to fly at those low altitudes. It becomes easy to clear rooms. It becomes easier to do this because you've spent the time to do it and you actually know what to look for and you know how to handle those situations. One of the techniques that we learned to help us with risk assessment, especially in a combat environment, I was flying, small airplanes and doing it in the mountains. We learned how to fly on the military crest, which is, 70 to 80% up a ridgeline. So instead of flying as low as possible down in the valley, we would fly a little bit up on a ridgeline. And the primary purpose for that, at least when I first started, I was a little confused. Like, why aren't we down in the valley? It seems like that would be the most protected for us. Until one of my, trainers says, yeah, well, that's great until the enemy opens up with anti-aircraft fire from the middle of the valley. And now you've got to fly all the way up the ridgeline to hop over to the other side and to put rocks between you and the bullets. And then it made a lot more sense to me. I was like, oh, okay. And so I realized that it's a combination of understanding the situation that you're in to really find yourself the sweet spot of how to accept risk that you can and should accept and mitigate the risks that you are able to mitigate. Now, as we talked about, you can't get to zero risk in life, no matter what you try to do, because that's not living. But you do try to do the best you can at finding the ways to make your life less risky on a general basis.
As you were talking, I was thinking about really the two things when it comes to risk management that you're doing. You want to decrease the likelihoods that the hazard happens, and then you want to decrease the impact of that hazard if it does happen. I mean, you wear protective gear in case you crash. Your aircraft, you get shot down in your aircraft, aircraft gets stitched by bullets, you've got an ejection seat that you're sitting on, and you never want to have to use it. But if you have to, you give the aircraft back to the taxpayers and you ride the silk letdown, and then you can at least walk away from it. And you're not in a great place, but you're in a whole lot better place than riding that aircraft into the ground while it's burning.
Well, I didn't have that option. The only option I have is to fly it to the ground and hope I could get out. So
That's right.
A little bit of difference. But yeah, I mean, well, heck, my wife and I were talking about some things the other night, and we were remarking how our generation, when we were kids, seatbelts were not a thing. They didn't exist in cars for the most part. You had to pay extra to get seatbelts in your cars. Seatbelts and all the things that go around them are really us learning how to mitigate. It's not like you can't stop every crash from happening, but you can make them less impactful on you and your fleshy body. Your car may be totaled, but hopefully you can walk away. And there's tons of safety improvements. In fact, the last accident that I got into, I was pretty impressed. My car was pretty new. We got hit from the side and all the airbags went off, the curtain airbags on the side and the airbag in the steering wheel. And my wife and I both walked away with nothing, with no bruises. And we got hit pretty hard. I mean, the car had suffered a lot of damage. So it is amazing to me how much we, over time, if we are systematic in our approach, are able to accept more risk because we're able to mitigate the effects of it.
Yeah. A friend of mine, he had a Porsche, and he was paying quite a bit in insurance for it, but the insurance the cost wasn't for bodily harm. It was for totaling the car, because the car, it was a Porsche, and it was designed to collapse around the individual and to protect the individuals in the vehicle at the expense of the car. So it had crumple zones, and it had airbags, and structured in just such a way that there was going to be nothing left of the car, but the person would be intact. That is how you minimize the impact of that hazard by having something like that. You're not going to stop unless we come up with some magical thing that where the car transports itself out of the way of the clown who's about to T-bone you. It's a way to protect the individual and mitigate the impact of those hazards.
Well, and really, Derek, what you're talking about is what you've outlined with seatbelts, crumple zones, airbags, all these other things. The car industry has created a system to help us to manage and mitigate the risks. And that's really what we're trying to get people to think about. Just like in one of our previous episodes, when we talked about AI and we talked about it being part of a good managed decision support system, I think the same thing applies for risk and risk assessment, risk mitigation, for hazards and threats, is to build a system that allows you to do the operations that you need to. Just like you said with your ejection seat and with all the other things that we've got around us, the military or the airlines have created all these different systems to mitigate these risks and to make it safer, but to do something that 100 years ago, what we do by getting into a 737 and flying across country was almost unheard of because the risks were just so bad.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And you look at getting back to the old cars, riding on the vinyl seat in the back of my station wagon, my parents' station wagon, or just in the back without seats, just laying down on blankets. That's heavily frowned on today because you have no restraining devices. And you think, well, we survived it. But kids who were in accidents at that point didn't survive it. They didn't last through those things. Gating and reducing the hazards is all kind of part of it. You've touched on it a couple of times about you're never going to get the hazards to zero. I once had a boss, and it killed us to listen to him. He was a wing commander, and he's doing his beginning of the year briefing. This is year 2000. And he gets up there, and it was painful. I felt bad for him because he was so bad in his speech. And I hate to disparage him like this, but it was so bad. He said, we're going to have 0, 0, and 0, 0. We wanted 0 safety incidents in the year 2000. But he said that it was like he didn't have any other speech, but he had to talk for 15 minutes. So he had to say 0, 0, and 0, 0 25 times. It was actually more than that, to where we're like, oh my gosh, just shoot me. Stop talking about it. We understand 0, 0, 0. And none of us wanted an accident. None of us wanted to wreck an airplane because that's detrimental to your career, and it's also detrimental to your life potentially. Having that be the focus is the wrong answer. So focusing on safety and having that be your number one priority is not going to get you where you need to go. And it's not going to help you to achieve your goals. And like we've said before, I think all you do is push the risk to some other location or some other individual.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because as you think about this, obviously you and I think about this from a military perspective. We think about this from a flying perspective, but I'm also trying to think about this from just a standard, person's life or from a business. And so to your point, when you say that if you don't accept the risk and you just push it somewhere else, you absolutely do. If you're a business and you decide not to make a decision because you're just afraid of the risk that comes with it. Oh, well, we don't want to decide which way we're going to go next quarter or which products we want to produce or what strategy we want to carry out. Well, that's fine. But, I'll point you to the immortal words of Neil Peart from Rush. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. So recognizing that you may think that you're avoiding risk by not making a choice, you're really pushing it to somewhere else and creating a different hazard. As a business, if you decide not to run a product line or you think it's too risky, okay, great, but you're probably going to lose some revenue stream because you're not producing that.
Well, you're exactly right. What are the risks to a company if you delay making a decision or you delay releasing a product because you're afraid of the risk, you don't think it's quite ready yet? That affects the bottom line. It can affect the bottom lines in a number of different ways. Sometimes positively, but probably negatively if your delays are because of an overabundance of caution. Speed to the market. There are a lot of products out there, especially in the high-paced world of software development. If you don't get it to market, somebody else is going to. And so the risk to your company is that you didn't act in time because you were looking for perfection and you didn't want to take that risk. You don't want to risk the hazard of, well, what if somebody criticizes our product? What if they find a glitch in our product, but somebody else beats you to the market and then you now no longer have market share. And so you've missed out on all the revenue that goes with that. So you're affecting your team members, you're affecting the customers because you had a failure of getting something to the market. In the military, we talk about fielding equipment. When I'm developing an airplane or I'm developing a new gun or new protective gear, And the soldier on the ground, or the pilot in the air, that's on the front lines, he needs that new equipment to face threat X. And if he doesn't have it, the threat of bodily harm, the hazard that goes with not having that, it exists. So if I delay because I'm trying for perfection in that product, then what I'm doing is I'm just pushing the risk. I don't want any programmatic risk. So instead, I'm pushing all the risk to that end user.
Right.
And so he isn't any safer because I delayed. In fact, he's facing more risk, more hazards because of that. And you're asking him to then have to mitigate the hazards and the risks of what the whole reason you're building this product in the first place.
Yeah. And so I think that what we're kind of dancing around here a little bit is this idea that, one, risk exists and hazards exist. Two, we're not going to be able to, delay or mitigate. But at the same time, you can't delay or mitigate down to zero. But at the same time, I think it shows how important it is. The other topics we've talked about many other times is the importance of decision making and understanding where you are. And it goes back to another topic of mine that I think is fun, is the where's your threat. You have to understand what the threat is, in either A, making the decision and accepting that risk today, or not making the decision and accepting a different risk tomorrow, or letting someone else accept the risk. And so, how do we as leaders, how do we as decision makers, because like you said, there's no one size fits all. And what it really comes down to is it almost goes back to one of your fun foundational principles, kind of the OODA loop of being able to understand where you are in that cycle, whether it's in risk assessment, product development, decision making, I don't care what it is. These things all have to come together. And if you aren't the person that understands the complex environment that you're trying to make the decision, then you're probably not the right person to make that decision. And if you find yourself as the decision maker in one of those situations, then the best way to handle that is to gather, as much information as quickly as possible. But the antidote for most of this is really the point of your, all that you've been trying to teach. And that is, how do we become better decision makers? And that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah. And I look at across the country or across different industries, and the risk aversion or the fear of making a decision because of the potential risks and the potential hazards that are there. And so as a result, we just create other hazards and we take on other issues. We've kind of done it to ourselves in many respects. You look at the medical career field, medical malpractice, by bringing the lawyers, and I'm not saying this to disparage lawyers, but we have, by trying to hold doctors accountable and make them responsible for practicing good medicine, we have actually increased the cost of practicing medicine. And so there are doctors where they reach a certain age, like a lot of OBGYNs, they can't practice past a certain age because the malpractice insurance is too high to where they can't afford it. Contractual breach, you make a mistake and it's deemed to be a contractual breach. Again, that's a lawsuit. And all of a sudden, people are going after each other because of something like that. We're afraid we get not what we expected out of something. So we consider that a hazard. Like, well, I don't want that to happen again. And so we blow something up into this great hazard when really it was probably just a learning point. It was probably just it was an opportunity for us to go, that didn't work out the way I wanted to. Let me use that and make an adjustment and move forward. And then the last thing is that is a lack of risk mitigation, a lack of awareness. We do dumb things because we say, well, let's see how this works. No, that's not the way you approach things. You think through and say, what am I trying to do? And then in the path to get to where I want to go, what are some of the things that could potentially happen? And then you reduce the likelihood of those hazards happening, whether it's by practice, by adjusting, as a pilot, by adjusting course, by building in equipment that's going to help me a little bit more, safety equipment, and all these steps to mitigate the hazards of the risk. If you don't do that, then you really get bit hard and you're like, well, I never want to do that again. And so you become gun shy. And that's not what you want.
Right. And sometimes I think we've lost the idea in our society in many ways that sometimes things just happen and it's nobody's fault. The perfect example that I've got is I have a nephew who he happened to be a bread delivery truck driver. And so he had to work very early in the morning. He would go to the facility with the truck and he would pick up all the bread and then he would take it on his delivery route. So he would find himself, he lived about 20 minutes away from the delivery point. And so he would have to drive like 3 a.m. He'd be driving on this highway at 3 a.m. by himself to go to work. And one morning he says, I'm driving like 3:15 in the morning, driving down this highway road. And he goes, the next thing I know, I'm stopped. I'm, smacked up against my steering wheel. I'm stopped. And there's a tree laying over the front of my truck. And as he gets out, he says, I'm disoriented for about 10 minutes trying to figure out, like, where am I? What just happened? He gets out and looks around and realizes that a big tree on the side of the road just happened to fall over at the exact wrong time or exact right time, because if it had gone, a split second later, it would have crushed the cab and him in it. But the tree fell down, hit the front of the truck, stopped it dead cold, destroyed the truck. And so, the reason I bring that up is because there's nothing you're going to do as a leader, decision maker, whatever, that's going to stop something like that from happening. Random things are going to happen. And if you think, well, I just won't drive down roads at 3 a.m, or I won't drive down roads that have trees on the edge, none of that is realistic. And so, I think as leaders, as decision makers, as just people, we need to learn how to be a little more introspective and think about, well, man, yeah, sometimes bad things happen and it's nobody's fault. It just is. And I'll chalk that one up to, one in a trillion. I think that started, there's a lot of places, almost everywhere you mentioned it, almost everywhere we look, we're looking for some reason that something blamed. And this kind of gets back to where we started some of our discussions on this stuff, Derek. It was in the debrief, right? We wanted to be able to debrief to get to the crux of the issue, to get to the heart of the matter, to find out where, what's really what happened in this situation, to make sure either that we got a positive outcome or we didn't get a positive outcome. The problem is the society in many ways has gone beyond what we would do with the debrief, which is how do we make things better? And they're looking for, who do I blame and who do I get restitution from?
Yeah. Who can be at fault besides myself?
Yeah. And that's a dangerous way to be, because then you're really, whether you realize it or not, that mentality is you're trying to get risk down to zero. We've already talked about it many times. You don't get risk down to zero. And so by you trying to chase risk to zero, you're really chasing after a fairy tale, but you're doing it at the expense of others around.
That's exactly it. There are 3 things as we were talking that I was kind of thinking about, and we've talked around this. The first one, and I'll say this again and again, as you're making a decision, as you're going anywhere with yourself, your organization, your family, whoever, focus on your vision. Focus on why it is you got out of bed that morning. If you're driving to point X, why it is that you're at work at all. What are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Why did you go skiing? I go skiing because I love the feeling of going down the mountain fast. Yeah. Not as fast as I used to, but I like the feeling of going down the mountain fast. I love the crisp air. I don't even mind being bundled up and being partially cold, partially hot, depending on where I am on my run. I love that. I love sitting in a chairlift. There are some really bad things that can happen. I don't have great knees anymore, and I can really mess myself up if I did the wrong thing. So I stay off certain runs. I don't go ski through trees like I used to. I wear a helmet, like I said.
Yeah.
I don't go as fast as I used to, and I'm just a little bit more cautious. But the fun, why I'm on the mountain, is my main focus.
Yeah.
I don't like spending what it costs to go skiing. I don't like buying all the gear, but I do love being out there. I love being out there with friends. And so what do I have to do? After I focus on that vision, I find ways to mitigate the hazards. I find ways to mitigate how bad those hazards would be if I did. Like if I fell and have a helmet on, the likelihood of me getting hurt goes down quite a bit. And I also minimize the likelihood of something happening in the first place. Not by not going skiing, but by changing my approach to it potentially. And then the last thing is I look at the hazards and I ask myself, are they really that bad? Because sometimes the boogeyman is really not that much of a boogeyman. And you look across our country from in a business, on the news, wherever, and whether it's a political opponent or a part of town or an activity, we have been conditioned to be afraid of it. We have been conditioned to be afraid of that hazard well beyond what is reasonable. And if I crash a plane and it kills me, that's kind of bad. Yeah. But the likelihood of that, even with just a subpar pilot, is pretty low. Yeah. And every aircraft crash, I'm a testament to this, every aircraft crash does not end up in a mortal wound. Some people walk away from a crash like I did. The likelihood of that hazard being as bad as we say it is probably not there. And so how do we minimize that? And how do we talk ourselves off the ledge of it's bad? My dad used to say, it's never as good as they say, and it's never as bad as they say. Yeah. I think sometimes it can be as good as they say, but few times is it really as bad as they say. And that's how I look at risk management.
Yeah, and I'm similar. I found it interesting that last year, after they had the helicopter that crashed into the airliner going into Reagan National over the Potomac, it seemed like in the following weeks there were 3, 4, 5, 6 different accidents that got highlighted on social media, on Facebook, and in the news and whatever else. And I actually had a friend of mine from high school reach out, and he's like, "Hey, man, I don't follow this industry that much, but this seems like a high number of accidents to have in like a 1 week period of time. What's going on?" And I knew exactly what he was kind of hinting at. He obviously he's of a particular political persuasion and was trying to hint that there was, obviously something. And I was like, dude, yeah, this is a normal amount of accidents for the last week or so. And I was able to reassure him and tell him, because I do follow accidents. There are a number of websites that I follow that I get different reports of accidents, or there's a few guys on YouTube that I follow to get their accident reports whenever things happen. And if you're not a pilot and you don't follow that stuff, you don't realize these things happen every single day. But like you said, the number of times when it's like, fatalities is a pretty low number. But the number of accidents that aircraft have in the United States on a daily, weekly basis, pretty high number. And so, it's educating, I think, again, to any other decisions. It's about educating yourself as to what is the true threat. And as you've talked about already, how do you identify what the potential of the hazard happening, and then the outcome? What is the loss if that hazard comes to fruition? I'll give you another one from my personal experience. All of my extended family, I was born and grew up on the coast of Washington State. And a lot of things that have been in the news lately, if you follow some of this stuff, is that the Juan de Fuca plate that sits off the coast of Washington, they're waiting for it to have a violent movement again at some point. They know that it's happened in the past. As recently as 1700, they had a large movement in the plate, and it spawned a giant tsunami wave that basically wiped out most of the folks that lived on the coast at that time in 1700. And so all of the predictions and pontifications over this potential tsunami creating earthquake, now I look at it and I look at the risk. Well, they're looking at about a 75-foot wall of water is what they predict hitting the coast of Washington. And if that happens, I lose all of my family. And they get 25 minutes worth of notice from the time that happens to from the time the earthquake hits to the time the wave hits the coast. And so that's pretty catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is, then you go, well, why does everybody live on that coast if they know that could happen? Well, because the likelihood on a day-to-day basis is pretty low. But if you look at it from a risk standpoint, I mean, we know it's going to happen. It's not a if, it's a when. So, that's a tough one.
When you talk about that, I mean, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah,
that's pretty devastating. The likelihood is pretty low, and at least the likelihood, it's probably going to happen at some point, but the likelihood in your lifetime or your family's lifetime is probably pretty low. But the reward, why do I want to live on the coast? Because I love the coast, because it's gorgeous, because this is where I make my livelihood, and all the different reasons why people live on the Washington coast. You could say the same things about people living in the pathway of hurricanes down in Florida, or tornadoes in, Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Kansas, all those places. It's pretty devastating. And you have some mitigating things, but sometimes you don't always. Why am I there? What is my vision? What's most important to me in that respect? I've loved this conversation. I think we could talk on and on about it. We're going to have a special guest with us in the next couple of weeks. We're going to talk about risk, and we're going to talk about some specific risks and decision-making regarding risk management. I don't want you to be a good risk manager. I want you to be a good decision maker. And part of the decision-making is taking into account the hazards around you, the likelihood of those hazards, but more importantly, where are you trying to go? And is it worth it? Getting back to your talk about the likelihood of it and some of your friends, and we talked about this earlier, there are a lot of people who don't want their kids going into the military because they don't want their kids to get killed. Well, yeah, that would be catastrophic to have one of your kids killed, and catastrophic to lose a family member. But think about the literally millions and millions of people who have been in the military. I thank God every day for those who gave their lives, but the number is not that high. So when you talk about hazards and risk management, the number of people who have given their lives is relatively low compared to the number of people, and even the number of people who have been permanently maimed and injured because of their military service is relatively low compared to the number of people that have served. I'm grateful for everybody that serves, and I'm especially grateful for those who gave the last full measure on it. But if somebody's not getting into the military or not joining in to defend their country because they're afraid they're going to die, I'm like, what? You're focusing on a very small likelihood, and you're not doing something that you think may be important because of that very small likelihood.
Right.
Don't do that. Don't
Yeah.
do that. If you think it's important, then do it. I'm not saying everybody has to join the military, but don't not join because you're afraid of being killed. Join for something. Join for good reasons.
Yeah.
That's what
That's
I
good.
mean, risk is a thing. Risk management, it needs to be part of all of our planning. It needs to be part of the math, but risk avoidance cannot be the focus. The vision of why you're there has to be the focus. We want to avoid hazards, but risk avoidance is not that. Risk is like buying insurance is going to keep you healthy. Buying insurance does not keep you healthy. It's a way to mitigate down the effects if you're not healthy. Delays in decision-making to avoid risk actually push the risk to the customer or to the soldier on the ground or to the pilot in the air. It pushes it to somebody else. If I could be so bold, risk avoidance by delaying a decision, it can be cowardly in some instances. Assume the risk and make the right decision right then when you need to. So like I said, we're going to talk about this again because risk management when it comes to decision-making as it relates to decision-making is absolutely critical to be a good decision-maker, to be successful as a decision-maker. If you want to talk more about risk management as it relates to decision-making or any other topic, make sure you go to www.askdereknow.com and we'll discuss what works for you. If there are any other topics you want to discuss, then drop me a note and make a recommendation and we'll consider putting it on a future show. Thanks for joining us again for another step in our journey to becoming confident leaders. Make sure you subscribe to Commander's Intent and together we'll all become better decision makers for better results. Thanks.
So that's it for today's episode of Commander's Intent Podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will be entered in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private exclusive leadership coaching package with Derek Oaks himself. So head on over to commandersintentpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Derek's leadership guide and join us on the next episode.